At 67, Theodore Sullivan's mind was sharp as ever, but his brother Ray convinced everyone he was losing his memory. Ray manipulated doctors, fooled family members, and slowly drained Ted's $4.5 million retirement accounts. Ray thought he was stealing from a confused old man. He had no idea Ted was documenting every theft. This is the story of how a retired engineer used his analytical mind to expose the most elaborate elder abuse scheme Portland, Oregon had ever seen, and how his methodical approach to justice cost his brother everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening from in the comments. You'll want to hear every detail of this calculated revenge story. Theodore Sullivan had always been the smart one in the family. While his younger brother Ray struggled through high school, Ted excelled in mathematics and engineering. Ted graduated summa cum laude from Oregon State University in 1978 with a degree in structural engineering, while Ray barely finished community college. For 4 decades, Ted built a reputation as one of Portland's most reliable engineering consultants. His specialty was analyzing structural failures and designing solutions for complex architectural problems. His methodical approach and attention to detail made him wealthy. By retirement in 2020, he had accumulated $4.5 million in investment accounts, owned his Portland home outright, and received a substantial pension. Ray, meanwhile, had bounced between careers: insurance sales, real estate, financial advising, always promising big returns, but never quite delivering. In 2019, Ray's financial advisory business collapsed after several clients lost money in high-risk investments he'd recommended. By 2022, Ray was facing foreclosure on his house and bankruptcy. The brothers had maintained a polite but distant relationship over the years. Ted respected Ray's ambition, but questioned his judgment. Ray resented Ted's success, but always maintained that luck was the only difference between them. Ted just got the good breaks. Ray would tell his wife Linda, "If I'd had his opportunities, I'd be just as successful." After Ted's wife Margaret died of cancer in early 2023, Ray began visiting more frequently. At first, Ted appreciated the company. Living alone for the first time in 35 years was an adjustment, and Ray seemed genuinely concerned about his older brother's welfare. "Ted, you're getting older," Ray would say during his visits. "Have you thought about what happens if your health fails? Who's going to manage your finances?" Ted found these conversations oddly persistent. At 67, he felt mentally and physically capable. His annual medical checkups showed excellent health for his age. His memory was sharp, his reasoning clear, his attention to detail unchanged from his engineering days. But Ray kept pushing the conversation. "I'm just worried about you, Ted. Living alone, managing all that money by yourself. What if something happens?" The first red flag appeared in September 2023. Ray arrived at Ted's house with a guest, Dr. Patricia Williams, whom Ray introduced as a geriatric specialist who could give Ted a comprehensive health evaluation. "Ray thought it would be good for you to get a thorough checkup," Dr. Williams explained. "At your age, it's important to establish baseline measurements for cognitive function." Ted found the visit strange. He hadn't requested a specialist, and his regular doctor had given him a clean bill of health just 3 months earlier. But Ray seemed so concerned, and Dr. Williams appeared professional and knowledgeable. Dr. Williams conducted what seemed like a standard cognitive assessment: memory tests, reasoning puzzles, attention exercises. Ted performed well on everything. But Dr. Williams took extensive notes and seemed particularly interested in moments when Ted paused to think. "Some of these responses are concerning," Dr. Williams told Ray after the evaluation, speaking as if Ted weren't in the room. "There are subtle signs of cognitive decline that warrant monitoring." Ted was shocked. "What signs?" "I answered everything correctly." "It's not about right or wrong answers," Dr. Williams explained. "It's about processing speed, recall patterns, executive function. These changes can be very subtle in early stages." Ray nodded gravely. "What should we be watching for?" "Confusion about daily tasks, difficulty managing finances, memory lapses, poor judgment. I'd recommend monthly evaluations to track any progression." Ted left the meeting confused and worried. He'd felt completely normal during the tests, but Dr. Williams seemed genuinely concerned. Could there be cognitive changes he wasn't aware of? Over the following weeks, Ray began documenting incidents of Ted's Ted, you called me yesterday about your property taxes, but when I brought the information today, you seemed confused about why I was here, Ray would say. Ted had no memory of calling about property taxes, but Ray seemed so certain. The incidents were always small, easily dismissed as misunderstandings, but they accumulated into a pattern that worried Ted's friends and neighbors. Ray also began inserting himself into Ted's financial life. "Let me help you organize your paperwork," he'd say. "These investment statements are getting complex. You don't want to miss anything important." Ted appreciated the help, especially since managing finances had never been his favorite task. Ray seemed knowledgeable about investments and genuinely concerned about Ted's welfare. But Ted's engineering mind began noticing inconsistencies. Theodore Sullivan hadn't become a successful engineer by accepting things at face value. His career had been built on asking questions, verifying data, and finding flaws in seemingly solid systems. When Ray's stories about Ted's confusion didn't match Ted's own memories, Ted's analytical instincts activated. He began keeping a detailed journal, documenting every interaction with Ray, every incident Ray reported, and every financial discussion they had. Ted's engineering training had taught him that patterns reveal truth, and he suspected a pattern was emerging. The journal entries started simple. October 15th, Ray claims I called him about property taxes. No memory of this call. Checked phone records. No outgoing calls to Ray yesterday. October 22nd, Ray says I seemed confused about appointment with Dr. Williams. I remember appointment clearly. Asked specific questions about cognitive tests. Ray claims I asked same questions repeatedly. October 28th, Ray brought corrected bank statement. Says I miscalculated my account balance. Original statement was correct. Ray's correction showed $50,000 less than actual balance. The last entry triggered Ted's deepest suspicions. He immediately called his bank to verify his account balance. Not only was his original calculation correct, but there had been several large withdrawals he didn't remember making. "Mr. Sullivan," the bank representative explained, "these withdrawals were made with your debit card and PIN number. 3 withdrawals of $9,000 each over the past month." Ted knew he hadn't made those withdrawals. He rarely used his debit card for large amounts, preferring checks or wire transfers for significant transactions. Someone else was accessing his account. Ted's engineering approach to problem-solving kicked into full gear. He needed data, evidence, and verification before drawing conclusions. If someone was manipulating his finances and his reputation, he would gather irrefutable proof. First, he installed security cameras throughout his house, hidden but comprehensive. If Ray was visiting and taking things, or if anyone else was entering his home, the cameras would record it. Second, he began recording all phone conversations with Ray, using a device he'd purchased for his engineering consultations. Oregon's consent laws allowed recording conversations if one party consented, and Ted consented to recording his own conversations. Third, he started independently verifying every, quote, incident Ray reported. If Ray claimed Ted had missed an appointment, Ted would call to confirm. If Ray said Ted had forgotten a conversation, Ted would check his detailed daily notes. The pattern that emerged was disturbing and clear. Within 3 weeks of systematic documentation, Ted had overwhelming evidence that Ray was systematically lying about Ted's mental state while simultaneously stealing from his accounts. The security cameras revealed that Ray was entering Ted's house when Ted wasn't home, using a key he'd somehow obtained. Ray would photograph financial documents, search through Ted's papers, and occasionally take small items that Ted wouldn't immediately miss. The recorded phone conversations were even more damning. Ray would call Ted and have normal, coherent conversations, then later tell other people that Ted had been confused, repetitive, or incoherent during those same calls. Most shocking was a recorded conversation between Ray and Dr. Patricia Williams, which Ted captured when they thought he was napping in another room. "The family is convinced," Ray told Dr. Williams. "Ted's neighbors are starting to worry about him living alone. His financial advisor called me yesterday asking about his competency." "Good," Dr. Williams replied. "The medical documentation supports progressive cognitive decline. We should be able to initiate guardianship proceedings within 2 months." "And the financial transfers?" Keep them under $10,000 each to avoid reporting requirements. Once guardianship is established, we can access the larger accounts legally. Ted listened in horrified fascination as his brother and a medical professional planned to steal his life savings through fraudulent competency claims. But the conversation also revealed something else. Dr. Patricia Williams wasn't a legitimate geriatric specialist. She was a nurse practitioner who had lost her license in California for insurance fraud and was practicing illegally in Oregon. Ted now understood the full scope of the conspiracy. Ray had recruited a fake doctor to provide fraudulent medical documentation of cognitive decline. They were manipulating Ted's social circle to believe he was developing dementia. They were stealing money incrementally while building a legal case for guardianship that would give them complete control of his assets. It was an elaborate, sophisticated scheme that might have worked against a typical elderly victim. But they had chosen the wrong target. Theodore Sullivan was about to demonstrate why precision and planning always defeat desperation and greed. Ted's engineering background had taught him that the best solutions are comprehensive, methodical, and account for all variables. His response to Ray's fraud would exemplify these principles. First, Ted contacted the Oregon Medical Board to verify Dr. Williams' credentials. As he suspected, she had no valid license to practice in Oregon and was wanted for medical fraud in California. Second, Ted hired a private investigator named Maria Santos, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial crimes. Maria's background check revealed that Ray and Dr. Williams had run similar schemes in Nevada and Arizona, targeting elderly retirees. "Your brother has done this before," Maria told Ted. "At least 3 other victims we've identified. All wealthy retirees, all convinced they were developing dementia, all drained of their savings." Ted provided Maria with all his recorded conversations, security camera footage, and financial documentation. Together, they built a criminal case that federal authorities would find impossible to ignore. But Ted also planned a more immediate response. If Ray wanted to play psychological games, Ted would give him a performance he'd never forget. Ted began acting out the role of a confused elderly man, but only when Ray was present. He would ask the same questions repeatedly, seem confused about simple tasks, and appear increasingly dependent on Ray's guidance. "Ray, I'm so grateful you're helping me," Ted would say, his voice trembling slightly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Ray's response was telling. Instead of showing genuine concern for his brother's welfare, Ray accelerated his theft. The financial withdrawals increased in frequency and amount. Ray began pushing for Ted to sign a power of attorney document that would give Ray complete control over Ted's finances. "It's just a precaution," Ray explained, "in case you have a medical emergency and can't manage things yourself." Ted pretended to reluctantly agree, but he signed the document with a slightly altered signature that would later prove it was signed under duress. His engineering attention to detail ensured that even his compliance would become evidence of fraud. Meanwhile, Maria Santos was coordinating with federal authorities to build the criminal case. The FBI was particularly interested because Ray's scheme crossed state lines and involved mail fraud, wire fraud, and elder abuse. "We've seen an explosion in these cases," FBI agent David Chen told Ted. "Sophisticated criminals targeting wealthy retirees. Your documentation is the most comprehensive evidence we've ever seen." Ted's systematic approach to gathering evidence had created a federal case that would not only stop Ray's current fraud, but could lead to the arrest of other conspirators across multiple states. The trap was set. Ray had no idea that his confused, vulnerable older brother was actually a methodical engineer who had outplayed him at every step. The final phase of Ted's operation began on a Tuesday morning in February 2024. Ray arrived at Ted's house with Dr. Williams and a man he introduced as Attorney Johnson, who was supposedly there to help Ted organize his affairs. Ted played his role perfectly, appearing confused and overwhelmed by the legal documents they presented. The power of attorney paperwork was extensive, giving Ray control over all of Ted's assets, medical decisions, and legal affairs. "I don't understand all this," Ted said, his voice shaking. "It's so complicated." "Don't worry, Ted," Ray said soothingly. "I'll take care of everything. You just need to sign here and here." What Ray didn't know was that Ted was wearing a wire provided by the FBI. Every word of the conversation was being recorded as evidence. Attorney Johnson was actually another conspirator, a disbarred lawyer who was creating fraudulent legal documents. Dr. Williams was documenting Ted's severe cognitive decline with falsified medical records. Ray was positioning himself to gain complete control of $4.5 million in assets. Ted signed the documents with his intentionally altered signature, then excused himself to use the bathroom. This was the signal Maria Santos and the FBI had been waiting for. As Ted washed his hands in his bathroom, he could hear voices outside his house. Through his bedroom window, he watched FBI agents surround the property. When Ted returned to his living room, Agent Chen was displaying his badge to a shocked Ray, Dr. Williams, and Attorney Johnson. "Ray Sullivan, you're under arrest for elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and wire fraud," Agent Chen announced. Ray's face went white. "This is a mistake. My brother has dementia. He needs help." "Your brother's mind is perfectly clear," Agent Chen replied. "He's been working with us for months to document your crimes." Ted dropped his confused elderly man act completely. His voice became clear and strong. "Hello, Ray. I've been recording everything." The shock on Ray's face was absolute. "Ted, you've been acting?" "I've been investigating," Ted corrected. "You thought you were stealing from a confused old man. Actually, you were confessing to a federal informant." Dr. Williams and Attorney Johnson tried to flee but were arrested outside. The FBI had surrounded the house and arrested their entire conspiracy team simultaneously. "Ted, please," Ray begged as agents handcuffed him. "I'm your brother." "I was trying to help you." "You were stealing from me," Ted replied coldly, "and I have documentation of every theft." The evidence Ted had assembled over 6 months was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors called it the most comprehensive elder fraud case they'd ever seen. Ted's recordings included dozens of conversations where Ray discussed his fraud plans with Dr. Williams and other conspirators. The security camera footage showed Ray entering Ted's house illegally and photographing financial documents. The bank records documented systematic theft totaling $347,000. Most damning was the recorded conversation where Ray and Dr. Williams discussed their guardianship plan and their strategy for avoiding federal reporting requirements by keeping individual thefts under $10,000. Theodore Sullivan's methodical documentation prevented what could have been a multi-million-dollar theft, said U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez. His engineering approach to evidence collection provided a roadmap for prosecution. Ray's criminal history was more extensive than Ted had realized. Maria Santos' investigation revealed similar fraud schemes in 4 other states, with total victim losses exceeding $12 million. Ray had been systematically targeting wealthy retirees for over a decade. Dr. Patricia Williams had been practicing medicine illegally in 3 states using forged credentials. She specialized in providing fraudulent dementia diagnoses to support financial fraud schemes. Attorney Johnson, whose real name was Marcus Webb, had been disbarred in California for creating fraudulent legal documents and had been operating illegally in Oregon for 2 years. The conspiracy was sophisticated and well organized, but it had one fatal flaw. They had targeted someone with the analytical skills to detect and document their fraud. Ted's engineering background had trained him to gather data systematically, verify information independently, and build comprehensive solutions to complex problems. Ray's fraud scheme became just another engineering challenge for Ted to solve. The federal trial lasted 3 weeks. Ted testified for 2 days, presenting his evidence with the same methodical precision he'd brought to structural engineering problems. "I approached this like any engineering project," Ted told the court. "Gather data, analyze patterns, test hypotheses, and build an unshakable solution." Ray's defense attorney tried to argue that Ray genuinely believed Ted was developing dementia and was trying to help. But Ted's recordings proved that Ray knew his brother was mentally competent and was deliberately defrauding him. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Ray Sullivan was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for elder abuse, financial fraud, conspiracy, and wire fraud. Dr. Patricia Williams received 12 years for medical fraud and conspiracy. Marcus Webb received 8 years for legal document fraud and conspiracy. The financial restitution was comprehensive. Ray was ordered to repay the $347,000 he had stolen, plus $1.2 million in punitive damages. His house, car, and all personal assets were seized to satisfy the judgment. But the case had implications far beyond Ray's prosecution. Ted's documentation had exposed a multi-state elder fraud network. Federal authorities used his evidence to prosecute similar cases in Nevada, Arizona, and California. Theodore Sullivan's case led to the arrest of 23 individuals involved in elder fraud schemes across the western United States, Agent Chen announced. His methodical approach to evidence collection became a model for other elder abuse investigations. Ted's recordings and documentation techniques were incorporated into FBI training materials for elder fraud cases. His systematic approach to gathering evidence had created a new standard for investigating financial crimes against seniors. The Oregon Medical Board used Ted's case to strengthen licensing verification procedures and establish new protocols for detecting fraudulent medical practitioners. But perhaps the most significant outcome was the creation of the Sullivan Protocol, a systematic approach for elderly individuals to document and report suspected financial abuse. Ted's engineering mindset saved not just his own assets but created tools to protect other potential victims, said Elder Abuse Prevention Coordinator Janet Williams. Ted recovered all the money Ray had stolen, plus punitive damages. But more importantly, he had prevented the complete theft of his life savings and exposed a criminal network that had been victimizing elderly Americans for years. The case became a landmark example of how analytical thinking and systematic documentation could defeat even sophisticated fraud schemes. Following Ray's conviction, Ted reflected on how his engineering background had protected him from a fate that had befallen many other elderly victims. The precision and attention to detail that had defined his professional career had become his defense against family betrayal. "I treated Ray's fraud like a structural failure," Ted explained to Maria Santos. "Find the weak points, analyze the stress patterns, and design a solution that prevents future collapse." Ted's methodical approach had not only exposed Ray's current fraud, but had provided federal authorities with evidence to prosecute an entire criminal network. The investigation Ted had initiated led to the recovery of over $8 million stolen from elderly victims across multiple states. But the personal cost was significant. Ted had lost his only remaining family member, and confronted the reality that Ray had never loved him, only seen him as a financial opportunity. The hardest part wasn't the theft, Ted told his neighbor, Mrs. Peterson. It was realizing that Ray had been planning this for years, waiting for me to become vulnerable enough to exploit. Ted's documentation revealed that Ray had been researching elder fraud techniques for over a year before Margaret's death. Ray had viewed his wife's cancer as an opportunity to position himself as Ted's future caregiver and financial manager. The betrayal was calculated and premeditated, not a desperate response to financial crisis. Ted used his experience to become an advocate for elder abuse prevention. He developed seminars for retirement communities, teaching elderly residents how to recognize and document financial fraud attempts. "Trust your instincts," Ted would tell audiences. "If something feels wrong, it probably is. Document everything, verify independently, and don't let family relationships prevent you from protecting yourself." Ted's presentations were particularly effective because he combined technical expertise with personal experience. His engineering approach to fraud detection resonated with analytically minded retirees who appreciated systematic solutions to complex problems. The Oregon Department of Justice hired Ted as a consultant for elder abuse prevention programs. His Sullivan Protocol became standard training for senior services providers across the Pacific Northwest. Ted's case had revealed something more disturbing than individual family betrayal. It had exposed an organized network of criminals specifically targeting wealthy elderly Americans. Maria Santos continued investigating the connections between Ray's scheme and similar frauds across the country. Her research revealed a sophisticated operation that recruited disbarred lawyers, unlicensed medical practitioners, and desperate family members to systematically defraud elderly victims. "This wasn't random crime," Maria explained to Ted. "This was organized fraud targeting specific demographics, wealthy retirees, recently widowed with family members in financial distress." The network operated by identifying potential victims through public records, obituaries that revealed wealthy widows or widowers, property records showing valuable real estate owned by elderly individuals, financial disclosures from estate planning attorneys. Ray had been recruited into the network through his failed financial advisory business. His bankruptcy and desperate circumstances made him an ideal candidate for a fraud scheme that required family members to manipulate elderly relatives. They look for people like Ray, Agent Chen explained. Family members with access to elderly relatives, financial problems that create motivation, and no moral constraints against elder abuse. Dr. Patricia Williams had been operating similar schemes across multiple states for over 5 years. She would establish temporary medical practices, provide fraudulent dementia diagnoses, then disappear before authorities could investigate. Marcus Webb specialized in creating fraudulent legal documents that gave conspirators power of attorney over their victims' assets. His disbarment in California hadn't prevented him from operating illegally in other states. The network's success had been based on targeting victims who were isolated, recently bereaved, and trusting of family members. Ted's analytical mindset and systematic approach to evidence gathering had been their unexpected downfall. Federal authorities estimated that the network had stolen over $50 million from elderly victims across a dozen states. Ted's case provided the evidence needed to dismantle the entire operation. Theodore Sullivan's engineering approach to documentation gave us a roadmap to prosecute an entire criminal enterprise, said U.S. Attorney Martinez. His case became the foundation for the largest elder fraud prosecution in federal history. The prosecution of Ray's fraud network had consequences far beyond individual criminal convictions. Ted's systematic documentation had revealed vulnerabilities in the systems designed to protect elderly Americans from financial abuse. Banks began implementing new protocols for large withdrawals from accounts belonging to elderly customers. The frequent $9,000 withdrawals that Ray had used to avoid federal reporting requirements became a red flag that triggered additional verification procedures. Medical licensing boards established new procedures for verifying credentials and tracking practitioners who moved between states. Dr. Williams' ability to practice illegally in multiple jurisdictions led to enhanced cross-state communication systems. Legal professional organizations strengthened their monitoring of disbarred attorneys and established new penalties for practicing law without valid licenses. Marcus Webb's fraudulent document creation had exposed gaps in legal oversight that enabled systematic elder abuse. But perhaps the most significant change was in elder abuse prevention education. Ted's case demonstrated that even highly intelligent, successful individuals could become victims of sophisticated fraud schemes. Theodore Sullivan wasn't a typical vulnerable elderly person, said Elder Abuse Prevention Coordinator Janet Williams. He was a successful engineer with substantial assets and a sharp mind. If he could be targeted, anyone could be. Ted's experience led to the development of new educational materials that focused on the sophistication of modern elder fraud schemes. Traditional prevention education had assumed that elderly victims were confused or easily manipulated. Ted's case proved that criminals were specifically targeting competent, wealthy seniors. The Sullivan Protocol became standard curriculum in retirement planning seminars across the United States. Financial advisors, estate planning attorneys, and retirement communities began teaching systematic documentation techniques to their elderly clients. Ted's engineering approach to fraud detection became a model for protecting elderly Americans, said AARP Elder Abuse Prevention Director Robert Martinez. His case showed that analytical thinking and systematic documentation could defeat even sophisticated criminal schemes. Ted received recognition from multiple organizations for his contribution to elder abuse prevention. But he remained focused on the practical goal of preventing other families from experiencing the betrayal he had endured. 2 years after Ray's conviction, Ted had transformed his traumatic experience into a mission to protect other elderly Americans from similar betrayal. His engineering expertise had become the foundation for comprehensive elder abuse prevention programs. Ted partnered with Oregon State University to develop research-based fraud detection systems. His documentation methods were studied and refined by criminology professors who wanted to understand how analytical thinking could prevent financial crimes. Theodore's approach combines technical precision with emotional intelligence, said Dr. Lisa Chen, who led the university's elder abuse research program. He understood that family betrayal requires both systematic evidence gathering and psychological resilience. Ted's seminars for retirement communities were consistently overbooked. His presentation style combined technical expertise with personal experience, making complex fraud detection concepts accessible to elderly audiences. "I explain it like an engineering problem," Ted would tell audiences. "Gather data, test hypotheses, verify information independently, and build comprehensive solutions. The same approach that solves structural problems can solve fraud problems." Ted's most popular seminar was titled "The Engineering Approach to Family Financial Security." He taught participants how to create documentation systems, verify medical diagnoses independently, and recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation. But Ted's education mission extended beyond fraud prevention. He also addressed the emotional challenges of confronting family betrayal and the importance of maintaining independence while accepting appropriate help. "Family relationships shouldn't require you to surrender your critical thinking," Ted would emphasize. "Love and trust are important, but verification and documentation are essential." Ted's work attracted national attention when he was invited to testify before a congressional subcommittee on elder abuse prevention. His testimony provided lawmakers with practical recommendations for strengthening legal protections for elderly Americans. "Criminals are becoming more sophisticated in their targeting of elderly victims," Ted told Congress. "Our prevention efforts must become equally sophisticated in response." Ted's congressional testimony led to federal legislation requiring enhanced verification procedures for power of attorney documents and strengthened penalties for medical fraud targeting elderly victims. The Sullivan Act established federal standards for elder abuse documentation and created funding for prevention education programs based on Ted's systematic approach to fraud detection. As Ted approached his 70th birthday, he reflected on how Ray's betrayal had unexpectedly become the foundation for a meaningful second career in elder abuse prevention. What had begun as personal victimization had evolved into a national advocacy mission. Ted's documentation and prevention methods had been implemented by elder services organizations across the United States. The Sullivan Protocol was being used to train thousands of elderly Americans in fraud detection and prevention techniques. "Theodore's engineering approach to elder abuse prevention has probably saved tens of millions of dollars in potential fraud losses," said FBI Elder Abuse Prevention Coordinator Sarah Kim. His case became a template for protecting elderly Americans from sophisticated financial crimes. Ted had also used his experience to strengthen relationships with his remaining friends and neighbors. The isolation that had made him vulnerable to Ray's manipulation had been replaced by a strong community network of people who understood the importance of mutual protection and support. Mrs. Peterson, Ted's neighbor, had become his closest friend and confidant. "Ted taught our entire neighborhood how to recognize fraud attempts," she said. "We look out for each other now in ways we never did before." Ted's house had become an informal community center for elder abuse prevention activities. He hosted monthly meetings where elderly residents shared experiences and learned new protection techniques. The financial recovery from Ray's theft had been complete. Ted's $4.5 million in assets had grown to over $6 million through careful investment and the punitive damages awarded in his case. But Ted's focus had shifted from personal wealth accumulation to community protection and education. "Money was never the most important thing Ray stole from me," Ted explained. "He stole my sense of family security and trust. Getting that back required building new relationships based on mutual respect and honest communication." Ted had established a foundation that provided free elder abuse prevention education and legal assistance to elderly victims of financial fraud. The foundation was funded by his settlement from Ray's case and donations from grateful seminar participants. Ray remained in federal prison, with 8 years remaining on his sentence. He had never contacted Ted to apologize or express remorse for his crimes. Ted had accepted that Ray would never acknowledge the magnitude of his betrayal. "I don't expect Ray to change," Ted said, "but I've changed how I approach family relationships and personal security. That's something I can control." Today, Theodore Sullivan's methodical approach to life includes systematic protection against betrayal, ongoing education about emerging fraud schemes, and active participation in community-based elder protection networks. His house contains the same security systems he installed to document Ray's theft, but now they provide peace of mind rather than evidence gathering. His detailed journaling continues, but it focuses on positive community activities rather than suspicious behavior. Ted's engineering precision which had made him vulnerable to Ray's exploitation by creating predictable routines in isolation, had ultimately become his protection by enabling systematic fraud detection and prevention. The brother who had tried to steal Ted's life savings was serving 15 years in federal prison. The $347,000 Ray had stolen had been recovered, along with $1.2 million in punitive damages. The criminal network Ray had joined was dismantled, with 23 conspirators convicted and over $50 million in stolen assets recovered. But Ted's real victory was measured in prevention rather than prosecution. The thousands of elderly Americans who had learned his documentation techniques, the federal legislation that strengthened elder abuse protections, and the research programs that continued developing new fraud prevention methods. Ray thought my engineering mind made me an easy target because I was systematic and predictable, Ted reflected. He was right about the systematic part, but wrong about the easy part. Systematic thinking doesn't just create routines, it creates solutions. Ted's story had become a landmark case in elder abuse prevention education, demonstrating that analytical thinking and methodical documentation could defeat even sophisticated family betrayal schemes. At 70, Ted maintained the same intellectual curiosity and precision that had defined his engineering career. But now those qualities served a broader purpose, protecting vulnerable elderly Americans from the kind of betrayal he had experienced and overcome. The last entry in Ted's daily journal read, "Family loyalty must be earned through respect and honesty, not assumed through blood relations. Trust requires verification, love requires boundaries, and security requires preparation." Ray had taught Ted these lessons through betrayal. Ted was teaching them to others through education and advocacy. The engineering approach to life that had made Ted successful professionally had ultimately made him resilient personally. Some problems require technical solutions, and some challenges require systematic responses. Theodore Sullivan had proven that with the right approach, even family betrayal could be solved like any other engineering problem, through careful analysis, systematic documentation, and comprehensive solutions. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Remember, trust should be verified, family loyalty should be earned, and systematic thinking can protect you from even sophisticated betrayal.